This is Church History Lecture number 19 we're going to be talking about church history. Specifically, we're going to concentrate mostly on the Crusades because that's the period of time we're in. How many have noticed the movies that have been coming out of late? For instance, Kingdom of Heaven. What was the one with Revelation, certainly, which was a laugh from a theological point of view. What's the one that had Matrix guy in it, Kiefer, or what was?
The Matrix Revolutions?
No. But although those had messianic themes to it. Keanu Reeves, and he was in a movie about where he was an exorcist or something, or okay. Constantine. There you go. Notice the themes that are coming out in society today. Have you read about the fast-track efforts to make Pope John Paul a saint? And, it's a screwy process, quite frankly. But one of the things they do is they have to verify miracles. So the Catholic Church is becoming much more miracle-oriented in general. They're talking a lot more about it. Brethren, this is not just happenstance. There are things happening in the world today. There's a reason... movie makers respond to the pulse of the population. They respond to what people are thinking about and themes and etc. So there's even a book out there, which I was telling some people earlier, you can see advertised out on the net, that claims that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world and that it's going to take over the world. And he lays out this elaborate argument. Now, he's not talking about true Christianity, by the way. But it just goes to show people are becoming religiously oriented, and yet, think of your friends, think of your coworkers, think of the people at this fancy resort we were staying at on vacation. If they have an interest in religion, it is a whiz-bang emotional end of things. They don't want substance. They don't want somebody cripping their style, telling them how they have to live. They're not interested in a relationship with God like that, but boy, they are fascinated with the idea of miracles, with manifestations. That's the thing about, if you think about the stigmata and the various manifestations of weeping statues and etc., what do any of those have to do with how you live your life? They have nothing to do with how you live your life. They're just a thrill in a sense. It's almost like what we want is a God who's real good at magic effects or special effects.
Or a sugar daddy, so you can be successful.
Right, or a sugar daddy that underwrites your success. There is a reason that as we approach the end times, our entire society is becoming more oriented toward this kind of emotional show religion that doesn't really affect how we live our lives. If ever there was a society that needed guidance on how to live our lives, because we were talking about how now they're having to taser, or no, they didn't taser her, they just put her in handcuffs, kindergarten kids, because they can't control them. Our society is unraveling. They're talking about how, normally even when you have money you can escape it. But that isn't always true. The rich British for years have bought villas along the Spanish coast. Very wonderful climate to go to and so forth. Well, now they're being terrorized by Albanian and Romanian gangs that will break into these compounds and steal them blind. Again, what did the EU do? It took down the barriers so that these people can travel freely. Even the wealthy are having difficulty escaping it all. As society unravels, and I hate to say this, brethren, it's going to start impacting you and me.
Talking about America, you haven't gone to Chimayo, where they have that dirt, but
I've read about it.
At night they fill it up, though.
They do?
And they say it never empties. It never empties.
Well, we can probably see effects of that even in our area in a small way, but that's really what that's the way we're headed, and you're going to see more movies with those kinds of themes. You're going to see books out like the Da Vinci Code.
2006.
I'm sorry?
2006, the movie comes out.
Okay. Now, I have talked to people in the church who thought, that was a good book, and I could filter out everything. Brethren, don't over-assume your ability to filter. You can be affected. It's like why I didn't choose, and again, I'm not going to criticize anybody that chooses differently, but why I did not choose to go to the Passion of the Christ. I didn't want those visual images implanted in my mind so that when I read John 14, 15, 16, 17, I don't want to think of the Passion of the Christ, because that was not an accurate portrayal of what happened. That was a Catholic mystic's view. And I don't want the Catholic mystic's view in my mind. All of us have a challenge to filter. Well, interestingly enough, it is important that we understand which is unfortunately our enemy. Our enemy is this world's religion of, primarily so, the whore who rides the beast, the Catholic Church. We need to understand a little bit, not a lot, about what makes them tick, because they will be our enemies here shortly, too. And they're going to be coming from certain directions that they've come from before. This isn't the first time they've crossed this ground. Yes, Joan?
Now, the other churches, do they say that God's kingdom is going to be here on this earth?
It varies very highly. There's some who say, like, that the kingdom of God is already on the earth. Christ already, came. I mean, you have premillennialists, postmillennialists. I don't know all the different categories, but about anything you can imagine, they'll say it.
Yeah, because I heard they were having this discussion where saying that someone was saying the kingdom is going to be here on this earth.
There are a few that teach that, evangelicals, but there's a lot of them that don't. Jehovah's Witnesses do. So, I mean, there is some relevance in terms we're going to find some interesting parallels with our own society by studying history. In fact, that's one of the biggest benefits of studying history, is that you'll find that there is nothing new under the sun. The Bible knew what it was talking about. Human nature has not changed. From the time of Adam and Eve until today, human nature is the same. Technology changes, but the motivations and the tendencies of the human heart have not changed at all. So therefore, ground that is covered today has been covered many, many times before. Now, we enter into the period of time of what you might call the 10th century, 1100s in other words, of the Crusades, which the Crusades, actually, there's a lot of Catholic history I didn't cover that I think is fascinating. Maybe not everybody else would. But the time of the hermit monks, the establishment of the monastic system, the establishment of the government of the Catholic Church, which is called Curia. It's the oldest bureaucracy on earth, and its roots go back actually to Babylon, even at that, in terms of the methods that they used and so forth. It really does teach you a lot about the basis, because again, even her daughters, which came out of her, still claim the history that goes back, and you find that they almost immediately began to throw the Bible out and biblical tradition left, right, and center to replace it with human tradition. That happened as early as the 90s AD that started, where Italy and Gaul started to go apostate already. And very swiftly, Gnosticism and Gnostic ideas and the Babylonian mystery religions concepts were absorbed into what became so-called Christianity. Now, I didn't have time to go into all those different details, but you can get books on them, and I encourage you to, because it will help you understand more and more their logic processes, because they are, in some ways, consistent, very consistent with their logic, the way they approach things. But it's things that you and I will not relate to, because even those of you who are Catholic were probably not doctrinaire Catholic before you came to the church, and so forth. So we'll start with the Crusades, which were truly a bizarre time in the history of Western civilization. And they illustrate something that I think is a great lesson for you and me. They illustrate that humankind, most of the history of humankind, we talk about liberalism today, and I talk about how one of the hallmarks of the liberalism philosophy is that they ignore fruits. But, it's not just liberalism. Mankind ignores fruits. Because fruits, if you pay attention to fruits, then you have to say, well, I want a different result, I better use different methods, right? That involves having to change your direction. Carnal human nature doesn't relate with that. They want to keep going down the same path they've been going, but they want different results. And I believe it's Albert Einstein said that that's a good definition of insanity. To do the same things you did before and expect different results this time is insane. So we'll begin reading from the Catholic Encyclopedia, Volume 4. The Crusades were expeditions undertaken in fulfillment of a solemn vow to deliver the holy places from Mohammedan tyranny. The origin of the word itself refers to those crosses that they put on their uniforms. The meaning of the word crusade has been extended to include all wars undertaken in pursuance of a vow directed against infidels, and this time they're talking about Mohammedans, pagans, heretics. And there's a tie-in with the Church of God history right there. Or those under the ban of excommunication. After pronouncing a solemn vow, each warrior received a cross from the hands of the Pope or his legates and was therefore considered a soldier of the Church. Is that a term that's used in the New Testament from a literal point of view at all? I mean, there's symbols of Christian warfare that is used, put on the whole armor of God. But the idea that, that's a contradiction in terms. Soldier of the Church is a contradiction in terms. So anyway, they were considered a soldier of the Church. Crusaders were also granted indulgences and temporal privileges, such as exemption from civil jurisdiction, inviolability of persons or lands, and so forth. One of the things that it's hard for us to get out of our current 21st century mentality and relate with what these people were like, even though many of them saw the corruption that existed in their society, and most of it, by the way, revolved around the church. The church at this time was extremely corrupt. Even though they could see that, they still felt it was the Church of God, and therefore they could not go against its teachings. Actually, this is a period of time as we go up to about the 1400s when that actually began to change. Prior to that, the Pope during this period was trying to assert religious authority over all political or any other kind of authority. And he succeeded to the extent that he had emperors coming on their hands and knees begging his forgiveness for fear that they would be excommunicated and would fry in hell forever. And if you really believe in that frying in hell forever doctrine, you do what you have to do to avoid that. And so now at the end of this period, though, that totally reverses. A lot of the temporal power was taken away from the popes, and they didn't have that kind of authority over mankind again. But it runs throughout this. You'll see the motivations of people. If a corrupt pope says, you haven't lived a very holy life, but if you take up a crusade and you are willing to do this, then therefore, even if you die, you get immediate entrance into heaven. It's an indulgence. It's a get out of jail free kind of concept. Now, you and I look back on that and say, what a racket. And it was an unmistakable racket. It was a huge moneymaker for the Catholic Church. But people believed it. Yes.
But how about now, like the same deal with the pedophiles? I guess they're the same premise that they're going to forgive all these priests and still are Catholic.
Well, I think what it shows is that the corruption it didn't go away. It's always been there. In one form or another, it's manifested. But there's no way they cannot defend the way they've handled the pedophile homosexual crisis in the Catholic Church. So what do? They just ignore it. They don't address it.
I'm just saying all the people that are like the lay people, they'll just continue to go even though
most of them will. There are conservative movements developing in the thank you, Mark. Question had to do with what about the homosexual pedophile crisis in the Catholic Church? Aren't they just covering that up in the same way, and the lay members continue to go? There's that element of the lay membership who will blindly keep going no matter what, but there are movements now, conservative Catholic movement, where they will send their money to a separate group now. They don't want the hierarchy to get it. Now, this is, by the way, a tremendous threat to the Catholic Church. They will not put up with that.
That's what my brother did. When they were Catholic and they moved away because of the things they were seeing, they separated.
they will have to put up with what?
They cannot put up with people setting, or in effect, the conservative movement that exists. Part of what Mel Gibson and others are part of. They can't put up with that because it undermines the hierarchy. The hierarchy is the only thing. It's almost like righteous government from the top down is the best form of government. Unrighteous government from the top down is the worst form of government. And we've all lived through that. Yes, Marge?
Years ago in Boston, they had an orphanage for the nuns' children.
Yeah.
So this has been going on.
I've heard stories from ladies that have grown in Mexico. Yeah, same thing.
You see what the new Pope did?
What?
He brought someone for the doctrine of faith from San Francisco. Yeah.
Interesting place to get them from.
That's who the new doctrine of faith is for the Catholic Church, the guy from San Francisco.
Well, I think they're talking about various developments that have happened within the Catholic Church. The key is really, I think what we're going to see even and we go through this history, and I'll try and stick to it a little bit more. We've got a fair amount of material. But history repeats itself. And the heart of this organization hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Okay, so we come up with Pope Gregory the Seventh. This is in the 1100s again, or it'd be the 1200s by now. By the 12th century, this is from a book by James Brunderidge in Holy Wars and Medieval Lawyers. Interesting title. By the 11th century, Christian warriors who worried about their salvation, the salvation of their souls, could avail themselves of another reassurance. Under certain conditions, they could march into battle under a sacred banner. The really radical change in papal policy toward warfare occurred during the reign of that most warlike of pontiffs, Pope Gregory the Seventh. It has been argued that Gregory the Seventh revolutionized the Christian view of warfare, and that he was the principal inventor of the idea of holy war in medieval Christendom. Now, if you go back again, what was one of the prime characteristics of the Church of God going back to the first century? They were pacifists. They were always pacifists. Now, he begins to bring up, it goes through in some of the books that I've read, it talks about how first they had to develop a doctrine of defensive warfare. That it was okay for a Christian to kill in defense of nation, family, duke, whatever. And that was okay. Then they had to further this, and this is what Gregory did in pushing the idea of offensive warfare. Jihad. Islam in many ways is a religion that borrows from other religions. Makes me wonder where the concept of jihad originally came from. I didn't have time to research it, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a tie with the original Catholic doctrine of holy war. Yeah. Gregory seems to have entertained the notion that those who died in battle on behalf of righteousness were automatically and deservedly free from their sins. Can you imagine? Remember how we covered the issue of purgatory, that almost everybody spent some time in purgatory, which is hell light, but it's still hell? All right, now if you had the opportunity to get out of purgatory, go straight to heaven, all you had to do was join a crusade or join in a holy war. That's extremely powerful motivation for people. Oftentimes people, I've read many accounts where people who knew they were dying of some terminal disease would immediately go on a crusade. Because, hey, I'm going to die anyway. If I die on a holy war, at least I get into heaven right away.
Won't they be sad?
Yeah, exactly. They're gonna really feel like they were took. Yeah.
Yeah, come the resurrection, they're going to have a real eye.
Now, Pope Urban the Second in 1200 A.D., one of the books about him, Genesis of the Crusades by Crowdry, wrote, by the pontificate of Urban II, Western churchmen had in principle universally embraced the concept of holy war and viewed warfare as a positive value in Christian life. Now, we know biblically warfare of a physical kind and Christian life you can't put them in the same sentence. That isn't the way God has ever operated. One of the founders, the first people involved in the early Crusades was a guy called Peter the Hermit, which I don't have time to go through a lot into his history, but this guy was nuttier than a fruitcake. I mean, he really was pretty. He would be on Prozac nowadays or multiple other things, but he was very charismatic. And from a book called The Papacy at Its Height, it says the Pope with his Eastern ambassadors and the hermit at his side addressed assembled thousands from the cathedral steps, the multitude responding to the impassioned appeal by the cry, "It is the will of God." The red cross marked on the right shoulder was the badge, and it was at once assumed that by a great, if undisciplined, army. The enthusiasm was contagious, and both banks of the Rhine echoed with the Crusaders' cry. Hence began the series of expeditions called the Crusades, which, although they had no lasting success in the East, nevertheless changed the face of Europe. Fruits. They didn't achieve what they had set out to do, that they claimed they had a God's mandate to recover the Holy Land. They never achieved it for any great length of time. The longest period was about 90 years that they controlled the Holy Land. After that, it was very brief and sporadic attempts, and in the process, millions of people died. These are fruits of holy war. Okay, now you look at those fruits, it's hard to see God in those fruits, is it? And if you read the history of the Crusades, as they went on the process of heading to the Holy Land, they would rape, pillage, and murder their way all the way through. And part of it was, they were under a papal indulgence. They already had a get out of jail free card, so they could do whatever they want. They could sin as much as they want, and they could rape, they could murder, they could kill, they could steal. They were absolved from it all because of the papal indulgence. Even a few of the popes got a little sick of the process because it got extremely bad. Okay, now you'll have arguments as to how many crusades there were. Some say 7, some say 8. It all depends on where you want to draw the line. The longest period was from about 1099 to 1187 that they actually ruled Jerusalem and the Holy Land. This is where we get a lot of, Richard of England, Richard the Lion-Hearted, he was involved in the crusade. He fought against Saladin at the Battle of Armageddon. Did you know there was a prior Battle of Armageddon? It just means battle in the valley of Megiddo. The first crusade was anticipated by the impatient zeal of the hermit and his associate, Walter the Penniless. So we had Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless, a military adventurer. Before any warlike operations could be concerted, these leaders started with an eager but undisciplined multitude of 60,000 men for Hungary and Bulgaria on their way to Constantinople. It was not an army, it was a rabble. Thousands fell by the way from famine and disease, and many from a skirmish with suspicious or unfriendly populations. Now, there was a reason these populations were unhealthy, because they didn't ask for food, they took food. They pillaged their way along. So you do that, and the news of your advance comes in, and you have people prepared for you the next time around. They're not sitting ducks. So this is basically a rabble, and a totally undisciplined, wicked rabble, too, in terms of what they were doing. And turns out, this initial rabble aroused so much animosity in the countries they were passing through, they eventually wiped them out. So that was the first half of the First Crusade. Great fruits, right?
Oh, they just wiped out the Crusaders.
Wiped out the rabble. Now, turns out about a year later, let me see now. Yeah, about a year later, the first regular army began its march. The first group was just a rabble, and that happens again, by the way. How many of you have you ever heard of the Children's Crusade? Now, we'll hear about that a little bit later. Again, operating more in the sense of a rabble. In August of 1096, the first regular army began its march under the leadership of Godfrey of Bouillon, I guess it is. 80,000 men reached Constantinople and passed over into Asia with large reinforcements from the Eastern Empire. Now, again, remind yourself, we had the Western Empire, we had the Eastern Empire in Constantinople at the time. Technically, the Eastern Empire, they were ruled by Orthodox Christianity, not by Catholicism. It's a different type of Catholicism. But they still felt a kinship with the Western Empire. So they received large reinforcements from the Eastern Empire. First, they mastered Nicaea, and where they found the after effects of the massacre of the of the rabble. Finally, they passed to Jerusalem, which they took with great loss in July of 1099. Godfrey was elected king. Peter the Hermit attended the inauguration ceremony, and the assembled throng, falling at his feet, hailed him as a deliverer. This is for Peter the Hermit. And then, so here he is, this great deliverer, because he finally gave them Jerusalem, and so forth. Not another word in history is heard about this guy, which is just interesting. He fell off the face of the earth. The battle for Jerusalem this time around was very bloody. They went through, and this is kind of what you're going to see in this movie, The Kingdom of Heaven. I'm not going to swear to the historical accuracy of that, but you will see, it's kind of like ever since, what's the Mel Gibson movie on William the Wallace? Braveheart. You know the brutality of warfare in that time. It's not like today where we shoot missiles at each other or drop bombs or artillery. You had to look the guy in the eye when you disemboweled him, and it was a very personal form of battle. Well, basically what happened when they took Jerusalem, they built battering rams and siege towers and the type of things you're going to see in this movie, Kingdom of Heaven. I bet you what they're not going to show is that once they breached the walls, it became an absolute massacre. They didn't spare man, woman, or child unless the woman was worth sparing, so to speak. Again, this is sheer wickedness. Nearly 10,000 were beheaded in the temple area alone. It was an absolute slaughter. If you had been there, one writer said, your feet would have been stained to the ankles in the blood of the slain. None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared. They absolutely took spoil, and then they found out that the Saracens, as they called them, would put their valuables like gold and jewels in their mouth, or they would swallow them. So they started disemboweling all the bodies to dig out of their intestines or whatever. And finally they decided this wasn't efficient enough, so they piled all the bodies into a huge pile and burned them and went through the ashes to get the gold and jewels. So, I mean, this is the great motivation of people trying to liberate the Holy Land for God, right? And again, when you think in your mind, how could you do these horrible things and think you were serving God? Well, again, they were under a papal indulgence. They could use whatever methods they could. The end justified the means. And it absolutely illustrates a little bit more effectively that verse that says, when men kill you, they think they do God a favor, who do God service.
But we always have to remember that, I guess they use the part, I think about this that's too much before this, they could use the point that God had David and his army seek out cities and kill women, children, and everything in the same way.
It wasn't so much David as it was during the Exodus, or the taking over the...
So people in this world will use that saying, well, you know.
But you know, that is used to justify holy war, and yet these are by the same people who would try to tell you that the law is done away. So in other words, they take out of the Old Testament what they feel like they want to take out of it. But what is even more relevant, though, in that sense, is that when you look at the history of God's dealings with Israel, He didn't want them to fight. They didn't have to fight. They fought because of the hardness of their hearts. They wouldn't do things God's way. He started making them fight their own battles. God's preference is what He shows and has when dealt with Hezekiah and the Syrian army. God wiped the army out, and all they had to do was stand there and stand and see the deliverance of the Lord. They got to go out and loot them afterwards because they were all dead. Very few of the male sex, they said, were left alive, but a great many of the women were spared. Now, this is from, I think, the Catholic Encyclopedia. So, you tell me whether this sounds reasonable. A great many of the women were spared because they could always be used to turn the hand mills.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And, well, in other words, they could grind grain and stuff. In other words, you could get labor out of them, right? Now, wait a second. Man is stronger than a woman. If you want to enslave people, you save the men. The reason they saved the women was not to turn the hand mills, or at least that's just a side effect. Let's put it that way. So, in other words, you look at this. This is, I mean, some of the lowest point of human history by people who claim to be the very epitome of righteousness and God's will and holiness and etc. Okay, so that was the first crusade. They managed to take Jerusalem. They held it for about 90 years. The second crusade was occasioned by the recapture of Edessa and other. In other words, things were going bad for this. I forget what they called the kingdom down there. Anybody remember? It was under a French king, and but they called it something. I forget. No, it wasn't the Ottoman. It was something about having to do with. It was a European name anyway. So Second Crusade started in about 1150, 1147 AD. And it was occasioned by the fact that they were losing ground. They hadn't lost Jerusalem yet, but they were losing ground. So Bernard of Clairvaux was the preacher and prophet of the enterprise. In the course of this crusade, Damascus was besieged, but ineffectually, and the city was never taken. Bernard, who in the name of God had foretold success, he was willing to appoint himself to speak for God, had foretold success, had to find an explanation of the non-fulfillment of his prophecy and the unworthiness of the Christian combatants, basically saying the Second Crusade was a complete dud. Didn't achieve any of its goals, and you had this guy saying that, well, God spoke to me directly and said that we're going to accomplish all these things, and when none of them happened, he had a credibility problem, so he tried to explain that away. Do we see that today at all, by the way? I could point you to certain prophecies that people have been quick to issue that have not come to pass, and they're very quick to edit their prophecies post-fulfillment, you know. The Third Crusade was from in 1187 AD, or in that time frame, because Jerusalem was retaken by the Muslims, by Saladin. And so they took it over in 1099 and they lost it in about 1187. So they didn't have Jerusalem for very long. And the Third Crusade was undertaken for its recapture. It was an enterprise of kings, its chief leaders being Frederick Barbarossa, the aged emperor, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard of England, Richard the Lionhearted. Not a tenth of its army that set out arrived in the Holy Land, or in Antioch, because of both harassment along the way, because again they looted and pillaged their way along, and also famine and disease. Some slight advantages were gained, but lost again almost immediately through the bloodthirstiness of the Crusaders, provoking desperate resistance. So in other words, if you knew that your surrender, you were going to be slaughtered anyway, you tended to fight to the last man. So they didn't have a whole lot of depth in their army, and so basically they got worn down. Essentially they got drawn into a battle at Jaffa, and the rest of them were essentially wiped out. So the Third Crusade was also a dud. Didn't achieve much of anything other than shedding a lot of blood. Now, can we ask about fruits here? These are the fruits of righteousness. I mean, would that occur to you to say that these are the fruits of righteousness, or would you say these are the fruits of evil? And number one, either you change your methods, or you decide that this organization that's promoting this is not God's church. Would seem to occur to me. The Fourth Crusades was in the early 1200s, started by one of the worst popes who called himself innocent. Believe me, he wasn't. In 1202, this crusade was prompted by Pope Innocent III. They decided, after all of the first three had tried to go overland and basically lost 2/3 of their army before they ever got down there, they decided it'd be a lot better to go to the Holy Land by sea. Now, just to show you how being a good Catholic didn't mean you weren't also a good merchant, they came over to Venice and they were going to rent a Venetian fleet. The Venetians had the most powerful fleet at that time. Well, the Venetians saw an opportunity and they raised their prices on them. So they got into a big battle, an argument over the Venetians were trying to take them to the cleaners on the issue. While they were fighting over that issue, Constantinople fell. Okay, now they eventually launched. They landed in Constantinople, and they basically pillaged their own Eastern Empire capital. Even the Pope himself cried shame as the way they went about this. It was so cruel and outrageous were the things that they did. They basically overthrew the Byzantine Empire and a Latin kingdom established in its stead under Baldwin of Flanders. So in other words, in this entire battle, they never actually reached Palestine. So, this crusade was to free the Holy Land, and they fought in Venice, they fought in Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire, which was a Orthodox Catholic empire, was overthrown by these people, and they slaughtered a whole lot of people. They didn't do anything to the Muslims. So this, again, was the fruits. Now, because of various processes that the papacy put in effect, it was like if you were let's say you were a rich landowner, you were a duke somewhere, you were going on a crusade. It was the tradition of the time, partly to get that indulgence, that get out of jail free card. You had to sign a will saying that your lands would revert to the church if you died. So, the Catholic Church was cleaning up one way or another, big time.
Oh, Debbie has a question.
Well, I just want to make a comment. A friend of mine called me this week. She's really strong Catholic. And she said the cathedral in Santa Fe now, this new Father Jerome is there, has gone so commercial that they redid everything real modern. It doesn't look like it used to. And they have a big gift shop in the back, and they're telling me now how much they have to bring every week
Wow.
in their envelopes. And she said that so many people have donated their homes to them when they died, they even had to reject a bunch of homes in Santa Fe. It's the older Hispanic families and that don't have children or whatever, and they had to just deny and not even take a lot of them because of the tax.
Oh.
They don't want to go back.
Interesting.
They want it free and clear.
It's all their whole home.
When you consider how badly the donations have fallen off to the Catholic Church, they still have the money to come up with paying off these payouts. It's a lot of liquidity if you think about it.
So the purpose of these crusades is to get to the Holy Land?
The purpose overtly, initially, the first 4 crusades was to free the Holy Land. And after that didn't work, the fourth time your army gets wiped out, you kind of start looking for other things to do.
So they kept it closer at all.
Yeah, actually. Now, interestingly enough, it was during the time of the Fourth Crusade that they had something called the Children's Crusade. They had this charismatic boy, Stephen. They don't say what his age was, but he raised up an army of 30,000 boys and girls. These were all like 8 to 12 years old kids, right? They went through France to Marseille, and many were lost along the way by famine and disease. At Marseille, this Stephen had prophesied that the waters would part and they could walk dry-shod to the Holy Land. Well, needless to say, it didn't happen. So then they were kind of sitting around scratching their heads, and just to show you, good Catholic merchants, look what they did. They came up, because again, all of Europe was Catholic at this time, so that's why I say good Catholic merchants. They offered them free passage to the Holy Land, loaded up what remained of these 30,000 kids, took them to Algiers and sold them into slavery to the Muslims.
So then why does the Pope now want to unify the Muslims and the Catholics?
Oh, he would if Muslims were no longer Muslim. That's the only way he'd do it.
Like the Muslims think of us.
Yeah, right, exactly. Their system's very similar, really. They're competing systems in many ways. But it goes to show, these kids, the whole religious fervor of the time raised up this army, came down, a lot of them died along the way. Then these merchants promised them free passage to the Holy Land and sold them into slavery. Okay, now by the time of the Fifth Crusade, they started thinking, this freeing of the Holy Land business isn't going so well. What else can we do with these people? Because again, it was paying off very well for the church with the lands that they inherited, and by the way, they sold these indulgences. You didn't get them for free, so they were making out like bandits. So the Third Lateran Council decided that heretics would be a valid target of the Crusaders as well. So they granted those who would go on a crusade against heresy the same indulgences that they did on those who would go to the Holy Land. Now, at first, it took a little time for this to sink in, but after a few years, they launched what they called the Albigensian Crusade. Not only was it lawful and laudable for princes to undertake holy wars for the repression of heretics, but it was a duty required of them and those who failed to take part in such a war sinned by withholding their help. And again, realize what power the Pope had. These guys were terrified of being excommunicated. You were excommunicated, you were going to fry in hell, and they believed that, even though they saw the corruption that existed in the papacy. So now they started saying, and by the way, this is the period of time when they started sending out armies against what was, in part, the Church of God. Now, a lot of them weren't the Church of God, but we were amongst the group that was being persecuted at this time. This went all the way up into the Waldensians, were a target of a crusade at one time. Now, during the Fifth Crusade period, Jerusalem was actually retaken for a year, but that's all the longer it lasted. Essentially, they killed a lot of people. A lot of them died. They took Jerusalem. They lost Jerusalem, and that was the sole effect of the Fifth Crusade, as far as the Holy Land goes. The Sixth Crusade was about 1227 to 1230 A.D., and this was really a kind of an odd circumstance. The emperor started saying this, fighting these Muslims isn't working so well, so he came up with a great idea. From a book called The Papacy at Its Height, it says, "The Pope lost all patience, charging the emperor with having wantonly exposed his troops to pestilence, and pronounced against him a sentence of excommunication." But see, the power of the papacy was beginning to wear off because this didn't intimidate this guy Frederick. Frederick continued his preparations, even though he'd been excommunicated, and having rallied his forces, sailed once more in defiance of a papal command to remain in Italy until he had purged his offense. He added yet another crime to his crimes by negotiating with the Sultan and his followers instead of fighting them. At length, a treaty was concluded which restored to the emperor the whole of Jerusalem except the Dome of the Rock and a few other towns. Elated by the bloodless victory, he returned to Europe, hoping to find the Pope would be willing to accept him back because of the results. The Pope wasn't interested in the results. He came back, he was under a threefold excommunication. First, for not going to Palestine, then for going, and lastly, for negotiating instead of fighting. So Frederick is now in the hottest part of hell, evidently. According to Pope, anyway. This compact that he negotiated didn't last very long, by the way. Finally, the Muslims took Jerusalem again. There was another effort to send an army down there, and the end result was that all of them were put to death except those that renounced Christianity for Islam. The king was the only one that made it back, and that was the Seventh Crusade. So I don't think I announced that. That was the Seventh Crusade. Is that Seventh Crusade was launched by this Frederick to go down and I think that was his name, Frederick. No, Louis the Ninth of France, and he went down to try to recapture the Holy Land since the Muslims had reneged on the agreement.
How many crusades were there?
Between 7 and 8, depending on who does the counting. Yeah, that's the seventh one. Now, there was an eighth crusade because they count some of the other ones differently. Okay, they again slaughtered a lot of people in Nazareth. And then the guy who was leading it died of a wound outside of Tunis. And his last words, okay, but point is, that was the net result, is that the 7th or 8th crusade also petered out when its leader died. And here, now you add it up. You had about 100 years even, roughly, of Christian control of the Holy Land. Nothing was permanently gained, and millions of people died, both in war and the pestilence that comes with war and famine and so forth. These are the fruits of the Crusades.
Dark Ages, that was part of it.
Dark Ages is part of what made the ages dark.
And then it just stopped.
And they began to realize, it's a good way to depopulate Europe, basically. So what were the results of the papacy? Well, you can't say none, because vast amounts of wealth were transferred from the people to the church. That was the biggest single effect of the Crusades. A lot of people died. There was nothing in terms of control of what was known as the Holy Land. They helped destroy the Eastern Empire, which later was taken over by the Muslims. It was no good result of it, other than if you were a guy on the receiving end of the revenues.
So initially, the church was trying to take over the Holy Land so they could be there because they believe the same things we do.
They considered it that the infidels were in charge of the holy places.
And then they gave it up and then they created their own Vatican.
They didn't give it up. They were driven out.
Pretty much. And so then now they established their own little Vatican.
Well, yeah.
Was Spain with them this time?
They gathered the armies for the Crusades from all over, but generally, depending on the Crusade effort, it would come from one region. So a lot of this were coming from France at the time.
No, because I remember the Muslims, or what is it, they were in Spain for like 300 or 400 years.
I forget the times.
But they didn't become Muslims. They still stayed Catholic.
No, they were Muslim.
No, what I mean.
Oh, the Spanish. No, the Spanish didn't really. Some of them did, but...
Did they have, was the Inquisition included in the Crusades, or was that...
It came up toward the end of the Crusades, and that's where a lot of the effort went from the idea of holy war, which wasn't working so hot, to the idea of Inquisition. They had more success in their wars against the heretics, and so that tended to be where they put their efforts. So by the 1300s, by the 1300 and 1400s, the Inquisition really started to come to the fore. For instance, in the reign of Pope Sixtus IV, 1471 to 1484, he was involved in carrying out some of the bloodiest inquisitions that ever happened. If you recall how the Inquisition operated, you were accused and you were presumed guilty it was the other way around. The burden of proof was on you to prove your innocence, no matter how disreputable you had no right to face your accuser. You had no idea who was accusing you of what. People would turn their neighbors in just because they lusted after their land or their property or whatever. Because a lot of times, if you turned somebody in, they were successfully killed by the Inquisition, the church would share with those who turned them in. It was, again, a money-making thing. And they would share some of the wealth with the people that were turning people in. And as a result, they basically accumulated more and more of the wealth of Europe in the hands of the church.
So the Catholics ever taught all this stuff when they're going through all their little texts?
Of course not. Of course not.
I mean, what their history of their church is?
Now, interestingly enough, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, remember? Okay, this was about the time that the Spanish Inquisition was at its height, and this was a time that the Pope declared all-out war on the Waldensians. So in other words, as I say, the Church of God was directly being affected by all of these different inquisitions and so forth. We finally rise, if you want to call it that, to the time of Pope Leo X in the 1500s. This is a man who was ordained an archbishop at age 8. He was ordained a cardinal at 13. He went through 27 ranks of the ministry in one day. Now, you think this might have been on his merits? No, he came out of a wealthy Italian family, and he basically bought the papacy. He viewed the ministry, the priesthood, merely as a source of revenue. He declared that burning heretics was a divine appointment from God, and greatly expanded the idea of indulgences for money. It used to be you'd get an indulgence for going on a crusade. Now you could get an indulgence for staying at home and just paying the priest some money. So this is where, if you ever heard the phrase, as the coin in the coffer clinks, the soul from purgatory springs, or something, again, we laugh at this. This is so commercial, this is so crass, but people bought into it at that time. They may even have seen it was corrupt. The idea was they thought the Catholic Church was the only Church of God, and so therefore somehow God was working with this group. So even though they were corrupt, I have to go along with the system. This is the period of time when the Dominicans and the Jesuits were founded. Remember them? The Dominicans are called the Dogs of the Lord from the name in Latin, and they were specifically organized for stamping out heretics such as you and me. The Jesuits were founded in Spain. Unconditional obedience to the Pope was their motto. And they were also founded with the prime goal of stamping out heresy. You can see that the Catholic Church is obviously feeling insecure at this time. And this is about the time, by the way, that Martin Luther started the Reformation. They had a good reason for being insecure because things were unraveling. The emperors no longer listened to the Pope. Remember what was the scandalous thing that Napoleon did when he was crowned the Emperor of Holy Roman Empire?
He crowned himself.
He took the crown out of the Pope's hand and he crowned himself. So it goes to show that the fear of the papacy was kind of being lost by then. Interestingly enough, it wasn't until the 1700s that the Pope actually issued a papal bull prohibiting the reading of the Bible.
The papal bull was forbidden.
The authority of the Scripture, he said, is not this is a book about Roman Catholicism. The authority of Scripture...
Sorry, Mr. G.
That's all right. I assume you have a deadline you're working toward. The authority of Scripture is not the authority of a naked book, but the authority of a book in the process of being interpreted by the papacy. That was their official position.
They were the authority of the Bible.
The Profession of Faith of Trent, Council of Trent affirms, I will likewise accept Holy Scripture according to that sense which our Holy Mother Church has held and does hold, whose office it is to judge the true meaning and interpretation of the sacred Scriptures. I shall never accept nor interpret it otherwise than in accordance with the unanimous consent of the Fathers. Basically, it is an affirmation that supreme authority for interpreting the Bible, regardless of what the Bible says, rests with the papacy. So, well, I do have a couple more things. Do you know, for instance, that we think about the Immaculate Conception of Mary as being a doctrine of the Catholic Church? You know that wasn't actually officially taught as an official doctrine of the Catholic Church until 1870?
Really?
Yeah. I found that interesting. From the same book on Roman Catholicism, says that in the Ave Maria, the Virgin is addressed not only as Holy Mary, but as the Mother of God. Like the dogma of her perpetual virginity, this title is an inheritance from the 5th century, when its use occasioned a great theological controversy. It seems to carry the echoes from other places than the Bible and from other gods. Historians of the ancient church have frequently pointed to the symbolic coincidence that the title Mother of God should have been approved in 431 AD by a Christian council in Ephesus, the city where the temple to the Mother Goddess has been so important to the business of the silversmith. So that's when it was first... it's a little transparent when you realize that the term Mother of God was applied to the Virgin Mary in the town of Ephesus after a council, and that was the headquarters of the Mother Goddess of paganism at that time. Another interesting thing, in 1962, the Catholic Church tended to blame all of the Jews for the crucifixion of Christ. They were the ones responsible for killing Christ, rather than the biblical doctrine, which is we're all responsible for the killing of Christ, right? It wasn't until 1962 that Pope John XXIII absolved the Jews as a nation and said the only Jews that were responsible were the ones that were directly involved in killing Christ. But again, he didn't emphasize that it's our sins that require the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So every one of us killed Jesus Christ. In fact.
That's why Mel Gibson uses his hand.
Uses his what?
He uses his own hand to crucify Christ.
Oh, he does? Oh,